Okay. Hey, Bob, welcome.
Hey Vasco,
It's great to
I'm
have you
I
here. It's a pleasure to welcome you. I know you were here yesterday with Andrew and some of our participants. How did that session go yesterday?
I think it went I think it went very well. There were more questions. So in the beginning, I was concerned, would there be enough? It was an ask me anything, so I was concerned, and I shouldn't have been, uh, if there would be enough question flow. And I think we left with maybe 15 questions unanswered, which is fine. We tried to prioritize. Folks were voting them up in true product owner fashion. So we were prioritizing the backlog of questions.
Very
I
good.
think it went well. From my point of view, and it's a little selfish, I thought they were deeper questions. I was very pleased. So it wasn't, there were very few things around like the tactical notions of product ownership. It was more so nuanced and complexity. And I really enjoyed that conversation
Well, I guess
because
you
I
attract
think
that kind of questions, Bob.
I don't know about that, but they were really good questions that I think challenge a lot of product owners. So I think it went very well.
Very good, very good. Well, we'll definitely have some of those questions today. We have some questions prepared since we have a topic for today, user stories. We'll dive into that after the half hour, so that we let people come in and get comfortable in our cozy lounge with Bob, who has quite an amazing fireplace there. So it's actually a fireside chat in reality.
It is. It's a little warm in here, everyone. So if I start sweating a little bit, just please don't worry about me. I'll be okay. I'll cool down afterwards.
Indeed, indeed. And we both have coffee, so it's going to get even warmer.
Exactly.
So, what were some of the maybe one or two interesting questions you got yesterday?
I think it was. I'm trying to think of some of the themes. One of the themes was like showing value, demonstrating value, getting stakeholder, not buy-in, but feedback and things like that. Um, One of the things was also navigating like different perspectives, getting different priority perspectives from different stakeholders, and how to navigate that. So that was an interesting theme that I think unfolded. We were talking about stories, which there's a relationship to this of to this talk today, or our conversation around what's important in the user story, or at least that was my takeaway. I spent some time talking about the conversation, and we'll probably get into that today, and how important the conversation is, and then how to create the conversation. So there
So,
was a
so
talk about
there,
estimate.
so
Go
there's
ahead.
one thing I want to dive into, and because we're just in the warm up, people are streaming in. Hi, everybody, welcome. Have a seat, make yourself comfortable. In fact, pretend you're at home, which you might be actually. I am in my little studio here. Bob, that's one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you. I mean, for a long time, that's one of the themes that comes up on the podcast quite a lot, which is this idea of conversation, right? And we very often, because even from our coaching background, we think of conversation as between two people, as something that happens in a limited space and time, a container that looks like often a meeting or a one-on-one. But actually, conversation, especially for user stories, which we will talk about later in detail, is a lot longer concept, right? Like a conversation is something that might start with an offhand comment in a meeting and then lead into a discussion in another meeting, perhaps involving other people on a need basis, a chat discussion over Slack or something. Like it's a much longer concept, right?
I think it can be, or you could view it as being iterative. If you look at the life cycle of a story moving from like an epic to a feature to a story, if you look at a decomposition trail, then I think there's conversations happening at each along that path. Like I very often think of like an evolutionary path of a story, like from idea or concept to cash, from idea to story to delivery. And I agree with you. Actually, I'm going to agree with you with a caveat. I think in higher performance organizations, you get that. You get this notion of conversations continuously occurring in snippets, but also in meetings. So let's not devalue meetings, right? There's meeting events that are important, but also the offhanded discussions, the ideation part. And I think in a whatever that means, a high performance organization, if you're getting the balance right in story evolution, then you have a lot of this activity. I want to get your feedback. I think there's energy generated. So sometimes we look at the thread, Bosco, of clarity around the requirement, and that's fine. But I also think having these conversations can create energy, like passion and vision and energy, which are almost just as valuable as the words, I would say, or even more valuable. And we get momentum. We get excited about, I think that can generate a lot of excitement around the story, the
And
delivery of the
actually,
story.
if I think back about the to what you just said, generating energy, and sometimes it's even more important than the actual words that we share. I think that's a critical insight, and we'll talk about that in the context of user stories. But now, for a moment, if we think about product ownership as a role or a set of responsibilities or accountabilities, as the Scrum Master, Scrum Guide calls it. Creating energy is a huge asset for the product owner, right? Because it helps drive decision making, it helps drive collaboration, of course, creates hopefully a shared understanding of where we're going. It can be a huge asset for a product owner, that energy that comes from conversations.
Absolutely. I forget when, I don't have the link with me, but I once wrote a blog post and the title was something like, 10 or 12 ways that a product owner can rip the soul out of a team. And there's a corollary to that of 10 or 12 ways. So that's the anti-pattern view. There's the pattern view of 10 to 12 ways that a product owner can super energize a team, right?
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
and
And maybe
and
you
it's like
write that next.
exactly. But
So,
it's
Bob,
it's
I think
it's
we need to
it's really true.
start
Go ahead.
welcoming everybody into the session. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And of course, we were already getting all energized with Bob on the conversation, as it were. So, welcome, everybody. My name is Vasco, and I'm here with Bob Galen. So, now the official welcome to this session, Bob.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for taking the time. And I hope you have a hot or a cold beverage in your hand and you can just sit back and enjoy the conversation.
Indeed. And you can also join the conversation on the YouTube chat. We already have a question from Loretta. Thank you, Loretta. I'll get to that question in a minute. But all of you, please send your questions through the YouTube chat. We will be reviewing those and passing those on to Bob as we go through the conversation. But we're here to talk about user stories, putting the user back into user stories, as it were. So let's dive into it, Bob. Explain to us why you wanted to discuss this idea, but also what are the problems, the challenges that you see out there that we need to pay attention to?
Sure. So I want to reframe it. It's not put the user back, but both are important. It's put the story back into the user story. And I think we've lost. So the the point I the driving theme for me for this talk is I think we've lost, or a lot of organizations have lost, the story in the user story. And that was the original intent. So we've lost the original intent. So I'm a dinosaur, and I was around in the early days of user stories and extreme programming projects. And I wasn't an expert. I was learning. I was part of teams, and I was learning to coach, and I was learning to lead those teams. And folks were using 3x5 or index cards for user stories, and there was this notion of how do you write them. So this was pre-Jira or all the tooling. I mean, we had tools, but we really used that. We used simple, low fidelity cards. And I remember the cards, there was very low emphasis on the words. The cards, we wrote things on the cards. One of the reasons it was an index card, a 3x5 card, was there wasn't much real estate. So if you wrote in big letters, you couldn't fit much on the card, and that was intentional. I actually wrote in very small letters, so people would ask me to write the user story so they could so we could fit as much requirement information on the story as possible. And that was a mistake. So there was the card in writing it, but we always said that the story card was a placeholder for a conversation. It was a placeholder for story writing, and I think we've lost that. And we've turned, I think, in a lot of organizations, and we've turned the user story into Gulp, a requirement document, a written requirement doc, and we've turned it Gulp into a Jira ticket.
Yeah,
And
I think the second one more than the first one, because I am equally a dinosaur, and I am from the time where we actually spend a third of the project writing those requirements, and we didn't have user stories yet at that time. And maybe I'm just too old-fashioned, but requirements actually required some discipline. Like you had multiple reviews, the document had to go through review and approval. Like there was a lot of bureaucracy attached to the concept of requirements, and definitely a lot of teams that I work with right now, they put like high-level ideas into a Jira ticket, sometimes a lot of specification into a Jira ticket, but it's mostly a Jira ticket. It doesn't get reviewed. It doesn't get criticized by a wide audience within the development or the project team, and so on and so forth.
Yep. It's that, and that's with the intent. I'm not, forget the dinosaur thing. The intent of the user story, and we want to get back to it. And it was a good intent, and it was a thoughtful intent. Was this is a placeholder for a conversation at a team level, a conversation with stakeholders, clients, customers. It was inclusive. The other part of the story, the user story, is not just a conversation, but I don't know if any of you have ever gone around a fire, right? Boy Scouts do storytelling around fires at night, scary stories sometimes, or stories. And if you ever watched a good storyteller, they paint a picture. You can envision what the intent is. Very often there's hand motions, there's passion, there's embellishment, there's excitement. And that's the intangible part. It's not just conversation. So there's a conversation that could be really boring. When I say storytelling, it's conversation on steroids. It's a conversation with embellishment, particularly at an epic level for product owners, particularly when you're describing big things and big vision and big problems to solve. I'm encouraging product owners to envision their team as around the fireplace, and they're standing up and they're painting a picture. And visuals, I think bringing pictures in to describe a problem can be very helpful with that. So I think we've lost that. We've gone back to this written stuff, and it's conversation, but also the lost art of the storytelling for the product owner, and really painting that picture.
Let's dive into that, because Loretta's question, I think, goes very much in that direction. As Loretta puts it, a user story is a promise of a conversation, but I've seen a lot of people worrying that things are not documented enough. How do you help teams going through the transformation not to worry about losing information and going back to the original intent as you were describing?
I actually don't mind if folks capture more information, as long as they don't negate the conversation and storytelling I'm talking about. I think every domain and organization has to figure out, how much do we capture, right? How much, if you're in a regulated environment, you need to capture things for testing, etc. If you're moving from a waterfall mindset to an agile mindset, you're going to have a hard time letting go of lots of documentation, potentially. So I think it's okay to overload the story. The question is when. I would say along the way as opposed to upfront. And if you have to document, but don't minimize the conversation and the embellished storytelling I'm talking about across a broad audience. And I don't know if anyone was here early, but Bosco and I was talking about, it's not just in backlog. I think of this as happening, a prime place for this to happen is a backlog refinement meeting or a session. But Bosco and I were talking about it happening along the way. in hallways, on water coolers, virtual or real, continuously talking about it. Oh, you know what? I remember that. I remember that conversation. But what if we did this? What if we approached it this way? What do you think about that? And it's just all these sort of aggregate conversations that paint that picture for us. So let's lean into that and then document what you have to, right? Because you're leaning into the value. To me, the documentation has less value than the richness of these conversations, this collaboration.
And there are actual aspects of the user story as originally designed and of course evolved over time to fit our current context that capture that idea of documenting decisions, because at the end of the day what we need to do is to document what we've decided on, right? Because
Yeah.
storytelling is by nature fuzzy, right? The details are in the mind of the listener, and certain things can't be left to implicit agreement. They need to be explicitly documented, and we do have the back of the user story, right? The confirmation part.
You have that. I write a lot, Vasco, as you probably know, and I once wrote another blog post that I'm sharing, and I was talking about the collective memory of the team. And another thing that we forget sometimes, and I guess this does complement this discussion, is we want to write everything down. In the U.S., we talk about CYA. I won't discuss cover your something, right? And we're documenting to cover ourselves. To me, I don't know if that's the healthiest reason for documentation. I think you want to document things that have value to the business and value to the team. And remember that you have the collective memory of the team. If the team can remember a decision and remember it accurately, then I don't know if we need to write that down, right? Just hold the team accountable. So don't forget that you have memories. Don't forget, right? Don't forget that we're envisioning things and we're collaborating. So I
So
think lean into the collective memory of the team and give it value. Give it
So
value.
as you were describing this collective memory, which is kind of a shared understanding that sticks,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I immediately thought of one anti-pattern that I've seen that might make it very hard to trust that collective memory, and I'm sure you've seen the same. And that anti-pattern is when there's so many stories ongoing at the same time in the same sprint for the same team, and maybe even some of those stories are from multiple projects. That happens, and some team members are working on some user stories for project A, other team members are working on user stories for project B, and they don't really share a space, a mental space either, where that collective memory could reside. And for sure, in those environments, you see a lot of silos, right? Like you see a big silo between developers and testers. You see a big silo between product owner and developers. So one of the things that I think about is the user story as an artifact in software development is actually quite inappropriate for that kind of setup, because that kind of setup completely relies on the ability to document everything because nothing is being done together at the same time.
So again, and we learned, and you talked about it, you learned this in traditional requirements, traditional waterfall requirements, we wrote down everything, right? We validated everything. We didn't do anything until we had defined it in the requirements. So requirements were sort of this container of all knowledge. The problem is it's hard to capture all knowledge in a written format, and it's hard to keep up with change, et cetera. So it's a nice idea, but the reality of it is it doesn't work. I never delivered a product where the requirement set matched the product as we delivered it. There was always this disconnect because of the weight, the value of even keeping the requirements up to date. So I'm saying it's a nice idea, and you can overload user stories to capture the knowledge you're talking about. But I would challenge that idea also. The team, the team or organization in this case should also be reflecting to say, how do we activate our collective memory to reduce the amount of writing? So, because what happened in Waterfall is everyone wrote everything down, right? And we stayed it for decades. What I'm suggesting is let's not just do it because that's where we are now. Let's continuously improve ourselves. that's continuously keep in mind the spirit of agility? Can we become more efficient? Even if we're in silos, what can we do to break those silos slightly down? And not just to break the silos down, but to activate what the efficiency of which how we work and the effectiveness of delivering things that delight our customers, right? High value things. So I just want to challenge the team to do that. But the user stories are this wonderful container that you can extend, but don't lose. I think the key of this talk is don't lose the essence. The collaboration is the essence. I actually want to hear, I want to talk to someone who's working on another product, Vasco, if I can collaborate. I'd like them to weigh in and have an opinion. Let's say they have a moment or two, invite them to a refinement session just to get another perspective on a story, or invite them to a storytelling session as a product owner, or whatever. Get those perspectives.
And
I
actually,
think we
now
would do
that you
better work.
use storytelling session, I was just reminded that that's what backlog refinement is all about, right? Because
Yes,
the story is an item that is purely a reminder, and or the user story item, whether it's Jira ticket or an index card, it doesn't matter. It's a reminder of that conversation that needs to happen. And in the refinement is where we actually understand why is it there, why is it important, what are we trying to achieve, right? Like that refinement meeting is actually the container for that storytelling.
absolutely. And I see a lot of refinement that's not that. And so when I say lean in, it's not the only place. Okay, again, going back to our discussion, it can be happening continuously in smaller bits. But to me, refinement is this place, is this special container, not for jotting down, typing. Oh, repeat that. What did you just say? Oh, I miss that word. I'll type it, type it into the story. You can do that, but it's for this richness of the understanding. It's the difference of the perspectives. Another active part or another important part of refinement is listening. I was talking to someone the other day, Vasco, and I said, I can come into an organization as a coach. I have no clue about their technology stack. I have no clue about their application. But I love to coach in refinement sessions, if you will, because it gives me incredible insights into the dynamics of the teams and their work. But I have to listen. But if I listen intently, and get through, oh, I don't care. I don't have a clue. I'm the coach. I don't care about what they're building. But if I listen intently, after a couple sessions, I can almost story point with them. I start I start getting hints about what's hard and what's not. Start getting hints about what's important to their clients, but I have to really powerfully listen and engage in the refinement. But imagine that. It's a wonderful window into activity. So it's storytelling. The team has to listen, the team has to engage. It can be it so a lot of them are by rote. That's write the requirements. That's estimate. But if you extend it into this powerful sort of container in the vision, it can be incredibly powerful.
So,
And forget the power, it can drive better results, right, to
so
the client.
continuing on that vein and staying with the storytelling, 3D Change asks us, do you have any thoughts on how much enterprise tool or processes like portfolio processes may even stifle the creativity and the passion for storytelling?
I think so. So the thoughts I have is I think tooling and processes and interpretation and requirement driven mindsets we've lost. That's sort of the premise here is due to a variety of factors, human factors, process factors, tooling factors. We've lost the essence. And I'm actually not saying any of that is bad. I'm so use it. But what I'm saying is you're missing something. Augment everything that you're doing and go back to the basics of injecting storytellings, which will make your portfolio management better. So let's take it up to portfolio management. Where's the storytelling at a portfolio level? Where's the storytelling at a value stream level? Where are the stakeholders? I envision a world, everyone, where key stakeholders come in and they paint their arms. The teams are around a fire and their arms are activating. And if someone is there just boring, well, we need to implement this for the IRS for 2025 taxes so that we can. Well, then that's not really. I would pull them aside and like, that's not very compelling. You need to you need to tell the story, right? What's right? That sounds. Where's the value? If it really has value,
And
then it should.
often this lack of value also comes from another conversation that isn't happening, which is why are we even working on this product,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. So I again, I this is more added. I think this discussion is more additive. Look for opportunities to inject this idea, this notion. And this is not a new notion. This is a getting back to basics notion. We missed it. We've missed it over time. This is the intentionality of the user story. So it's you're not experimenting with something new. You're experimenting with something old and bringing it back in. So can you bring this idea back into your refinement? Can you bring this idea back into your PI planning? Can you bring this idea back into your portfolio level analysis? Maybe not exhaustively, but I think there's incredible value if you can start injecting it because that's the intent.
Yeah, absolutely. So, continuing on that vein, Meme Loves Peace asks, all right, but how can I try to engage the developers in that conversation and that storytelling? I mean, I'm sure you know, Bob, I know as well that sometimes developers just want the spec. In fact, they might even just ask for it. Just give me the spec. Of course, there's some work we need to do as product owners to kind of shift that perspective and help developers also be part of that conversation and the storytelling because they have questions for us as well, right?
I do. It's one of my disappointments or my observations over many years and a disappointment in developers, I think, and I'm a developer, or I've historically been a developer. Whereas we want to be spoon-fed. There's all these metaphors that talk about, you want to be a chef as opposed to an order taker, right? And I think there's an order-taking mindset. Maybe it's generative from waterfall. When I worked in waterfall, I did view. I actually implemented projects. I gave people what they asked for, and I knew it's not what they needed, but I implemented it anyway. So everyone, I apologize for this, but I'm showing vulnerability. I knew better as a developer. I knew it was the wrong thing, but but I built it anyway with my team and delivered it to them, knowing that it was the wrong thing. But I looked at the world and said, well, that's not my job. My job I'm an order taker, and my job is to give everyone what they ask for. And I think Agile is trying to move us. So all of us need to move our mindset away from that order taking mindset. Unfortunately, I think a lot of developers still have that mindset. So from a Scrum Master perspective, from a product owner perspective, we need to start coaching and moving those mindsets forward because that's not the right mindset. So now it is a comfort zone for many. And very often psychological safety comes into play. It's much safer to give someone what they ask for than to fight the battle to convince them that it's the wrong thing and that So it's just easier to do that and it's safer to do that. So maybe, look at the psychological safety or the safety or the, sort of the empowerment of the team. But that's the model. And I think product owners, one of the jobs of a product owner, so product owner as coach, is to work with the Scrum Master to try to move that mindset over time. One way to move that is don't spoon feed people. So stop writing detailed user stories. You'll get a lot of heat from it. In my product owner book, I talked about writing crappy stories. I think one of the arts of a product owner is empower yourself to write a crappy story and to give it to the team. Well, and a crap part of a crappy story might be I don't know anymore. So help me to refine that story. I just don't know. And you may know, but don't share that you know. Or leave information out intentionally. I've done that as a product owner.
And
I've written.
in fact, that was one of the things that one of our guests mentioned. Actually, several of our guests mentioned in the podcast. But that's one of the questions we ask: how are great product owners? Like, what do they do? And one of the things they said is that they on purpose didn't write the details into the user stories because they also benefited from the conversation they had in refinement and could therefore together create the
Yep,
necessary information within the user story.
absolutely. It's much richer that way. But again, there's going to be, I think in almost every team I've encountered, there's this immediate tension, early on tension between the team, developers, but not just the developers, testers, anyone on the team wanting more information than they need. And product owners have to sort of change that mindset and wean the team from that and move from I the team is an order taker and I fill out the orders to we do this collaboratively. And that's probably central to this storytelling. Now, I would argue if we involve the team in these energized events, it's pretty interesting. That could pull the team in, if that makes sense. It pulls the team into the story.
So there's another conversation that Sharmila asks about, which I think is really important. So she's talking about how different teams collaborate and the role of user stories in that, especially when there are dependencies between those teams. And I wanted to slightly change the topic of the question, Sharmila, apologies for that. And I wanted to talk about the role of user stories in collaboration between multiple teams, right? Because user stories are an agreement as well, right? They're a reminder of a conversation that needs to happen. They have the confirmation part, and they are an agreement. Like when I give Bob a user story and Bob accepts it, that means that he's accepting to deliver whatever we agreed in that form as a user story. So talk to us a little bit more about storytelling, but also stories as collaboration catalysts.
I think it's a yes. I mean, you can invite. I think there's less of this. I think there is a notion of team-centric refinement or team-centric. It's our backlog, but there's nothing that says you can't invite other people to your refinement sessions or invite other people to collaborate. I talk sometimes about like I invite infrastructure folks. Let's say there's a feature team that is interacting with a dependency to an infrastructure team. I want the infrastructure folks to participate in the story writing and the story development. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care how it happens. It can happen in a hallway. It can happen in refinement, but there's a shared story. So it's a shared container, Vasco, and I want them to collaborate. And I usually encourage either side. I'm like, make the story reflect the exchange. So the infrastructure folks can say, well, you can add an acceptance criteria that talks about inclusivity. You can add so you can actually add acceptance criteria or clarity to the story that reinforces what you're expecting from the either side. Call it an integration details, conversational details around, but all right, I can deliver this to you, but I need someone to come over here and inspect the results this way. Or I need a script written in order for me to validate the infrastructure. Okay, so put that as part of the story. We only do that if they're working together. So the story actually becomes shared. Not physically shared, but aspects of the story talk about the guarantees or the contract for the dependency. And I want, I just think that's a natural emergence from the user story. But you have to invite that level of engagement. I've seen that happen at PI planning. One quick thing, and I'm not a SAFe proponent, everyone, so I'm not commenting positively or negatively with SAFe, but one of the activities that I think is powerful in SAFe is this notion of PI planning, where teams get together and they're planning their backlogs for a release, but people can run from one, if they're in the same physical space. It's a little bit harder virtually, but it can happen. I've seen team members like run from one pod to the next and then run back and run over. And it makes me smile because what they're talking about is they're navigating and negotiating the dependencies between teams. And they're doing it physically and conversationally. Yes, they have the container of the story that they captured in words, but the conversation drives the words, not vice versa.
Absolutely.
Bosco, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that networking that happens within a big room planning event is also a vivid reminder of what also needs to happen outside the big room planning. And when we see a lot of people going from table to table, that's not necessarily a good sign. When we see some people
No,
going from table to table, that's great. They're agreeing, they're coming to a shared agreements. But when we see a lot of people going from table to table, that's probably because there's way too many dependencies, and we may need to look at how the teams are arranged as well. So that was a great tip also for product owners to be aware that if you're in a big room planning and we're going through the refinement of some of the high level either features or stories for the next planning cycle, and your team members are jettisoning from table to table all the time and don't have time to be there with you, that's not a good sign. So do pay attention to that. I did want to focus on the other aspect of user stories, which is the user part of the story, and how they can be maybe catalyst is the wrong word, but how they can be harnessed, I guess, to incorporate user feedback. Because one of the common anti-patterns I see with product owners is that they want to write the user stories, get them implemented, and then get feedback. But in fact, a user story and the story part of the user story is a great tool to get feedback from potential users and customers as well. What have you seen works well for the product owners you've worked with to bring that user part into the user story, right? Like feedback before the team even starts implementing anything.
so I think it complements the user story. So the storytelling that I was talking about doesn't necessarily have to be the product manager or product owner. It can be them, and they're serving as a surrogate for the user or a surrogate for the customer. But I think it would be more powerful to invite, particularly at higher levels when you're doing portfolio planning, invite the user in to do the storytelling. This is the problem I'm having, and get them to embellish it. So now they're immediately collaborating with the team to clarify needs. They're immediately clarifying with the team what it is and what it isn't. The team can ask questions of them, clarifying questions. We're immediately ideating. There's option analysis and things like that. Well, we have this option and this option. What do you think? Give us some feedback. So I agree with you. That's incredibly lightweight. It's very cheap, right? It's not very costly. We don't have to develop software. There's a Nordstrom video out. Everyone, I would say, if you go to YouTube and you type in Nordstrom sunglass video, agile Nordstrom's. Nordstrom's is a department store here in the U.S. And they have about a 7-minute video where they're doing application development in the department store. And the team is actually interacting with real customers. So they have a planning board, they have Post-it notes, they're doing iterative development on iPads, but it's a wonderful visualization they're doing paper prototyping, which is so the way they approach everything is very fast feedback and then implementation. The other thing I would say is don't be shy about implementing software. But don't show it maybe on sprint boundaries or monthly boundaries. You can show it on daily boundaries or every 2 days. So working software does trump, in my mind, working software trumps words, right? There's something beautiful about working software, just a very small sliver of working software. So if you can develop it very quickly and then show it to a client, you can get immediate feedback. So there's story feedback, there's paper prototyping feedback, then there's very thin sliced veneer feedback. I remember a product owner I worked with at Deutsche Bank once, and Corey was his name, and he would put a prototype or a working prototype, the current version out in the hallway. And it was always working. And this wasn't a continuous deployment. It was, but his intent wasn't CI or CD. His intent was you can always come up, all the stakeholders can come up every day and play with the app, the current instance of the app. You want to know what we're working on? It's in there. What we worked on yesterday, it's in there. If you don't like what we did yesterday, please tell us today so we can change it right away. There was this immediate feedback. It was like drawing moths to a flame. Stakeholders over time, people realized that they could change, they could provide people, stakeholders, users could provide feedback to the team immediately. They could see that. I thought Corey was brilliant. I wish every team could, if they had the technology and the capability to do it, could show that kind of thing. You can invite clients into your work areas virtually or physically and just let me show
So
you a story.
in the on the context of collecting feedback, we definitely have to go with working software trumps words. But I was just thinking, in the context of collecting feedback, also storytelling trumps documented words, right? So
Absolutely.
go with that. Go with that hierarchy. Software, if you have it, but storytelling if you don't have the software yet, and then finally the actual words that you wrote down. And when we talk about storytelling, I'm reminded of one of the tools that it hasn't been mentioned a lot here on the summit yet, but it's a very important product owner tool, which is the story of stories, or as we call it, user story mapping, the technique that Jeff Patton popularized with a blog post provocatively titled "The New Backlog is a Map." And I totally agree, because a story, one story, needs to fit a bigger story. And just that, just fitting one story in a bigger story that other stories together put together, is a great way to already collect feedback in the viability and the fit of a particular idea.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up story mapping. I mean, I don't forget it, but what you just painted for me, Bosco, was the power of it. I immediately like projected in my mind story mapping stories physically on walls that I've seen, and how powerful it is to draw the team in visually to what's going on. One of the aspects of it is dependencies, and we talked about that. And you can explore cross team dependencies in the story mapping. Another aspect is what I call hidden work. Inevitably, and Jeff would talk about the different layers like infrastructure, and he would talk about the different from the user down to the infrastructure. And by story mapping, you expose things that you're not thinking about naturally, which is what's happening with the storytelling itself. Is that visualization, that big picture, the story of the stories will show you hidden things that are going to bite you later on, but now you can start evaluating the scope of something, the size of something, the number of teams you're going to get involved with. And you do it very early and very cheaply.
And very cheaply, because storytelling is actually a huge cognitive shortcut. It helps you to understand the coherence of ideas without you even worrying about it, right? But
Yeah.
like
Yep.
the good old days, quotation marks there, when I used to work on requirements documents, it was extremely hard to contain the context in my mind as I went through all of those detailed requirements that were
Absolutely.
documented. But when I go to a wall and I see a story map, I can immediately see the context. It's so much easier to understand how things fit or don't fit together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I love that ad that you made there. I mean, again, and maybe that's added to it, this notion of visual. I talk about verbal visualization and painting a picture, but then there's the power of the visualization, and the story map is that, and getting that big picture and being able to sort of look at it and scan it. Absolutely.
So, with storytelling, we get to the other aspect, which is something that all product owners worry about all the time, which is, okay, so how do I get all my stakeholders to agree on the priorities that I think should be in that backlog? So I want to explore that. I don't know if you've written anything about that, but how can we use storytelling to help us get to a common shared agreement on priorities for user stories?
See, I don't know if storytelling, I'm not saying it can't, um, but I want to actually come at the question from a different direction. I'm wondering if it's the product owner's job is it in the scope of the product? So let's say I was working, again, I'll pick on Deutsche Bank a little bit. I was years ago, this was many years ago, so Deutsche Bank doesn't do any of this stuff nowadays. But years ago, I was a coach there, and I was coaching multiple Scrum teams, and there were two product owners guiding this project across. It was distributed across the planet, maybe five teams, two product owners, and they were trying to create a financial accounting system and they had, I think it was 13 primary stakeholders. And in this case, they were country managers, Vasco. So, there was Finland, there was Germany, there was California, which is a country in its own right. There were country managers from all of these places, and every one of them had their view of what their priorities were. Does that make sense? So so there were 13 number ones and 13 number twos and
Of
13
course.
number three, right? And of course, and these poor product owners were trying to figure out and they were asking me, and I was trying to suggest things. And how do we delight 13 people? How do we aggregate our work in such a way to delight? And they were working incredibly hard, and it was never working out. We would delight two, and the 11 were unhappy, and then we would delight another two, and then 11 were unhappy, or 10 were unhappy, and it was actually creating churn in the project, and it lacked priority and focus. And I had an epiphany. I don't know if it's the right epiphany. I said, you know what? We're trying to do something for them they need to do for themselves. So we said the stakeholders need to sort this out. They need in the U.S. we have wrestling, so we set up a steel cage death match, which is putting. I'm kidding, but in all seriousness, we needed the stakeholders to work amongst themselves to figure out priority, to then help the product owners then validate that and move that into the teams. And we could not successfully navigate that. And so what I'm suggesting is storytelling can help with that. Maybe stories of failure, we can
And
have
definitely
stories
story
of,
map for sure.
yeah, and story map for sure. But I actually think a lot of product owners are trying to do something that they shouldn't. To me, that's a leadership challenge. That's a stakeholder challenge. Those 13 individuals needed to work together to prioritize along business dynamics. Now, in that case, the product owner can become more of a facilitator. And then that's actually what we did. So instead of a product owner deciding, it was product owner facilitating those discussions. And guess what? They did it, and they did it well. Now, in the beginning, there was a lot of resistance, right? There was a lot of silver bullet thinking. You have to delight all 13 of us. Well, we can't. We need your help. And then there was a pivot where they really then stepped into their leadership and collaborated and negotiated amongst themselves and made good business decisions from a Deutsche Bank perspective.
Absolutely. Which also highlights, by the way, you can check out Bob's coaching book. We'll put the link down below so you can find it. It highlights the importance of POs or product owners understanding that they are also coaches. And if you feel uncomfortable with that role, that's okay. We all do at some point, but you have Scrum Masters and Agile coaches around you who can help you with that. Because facilitating a prioritization session is a coaching problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, Bob?
But the mistake.
Sorry, go
But
ahead.
real quickly though, I do observe that I think product owners are making a lot of them are making the mistake of taking over ownership of prioritization. In cases like my Deutsche Bank. So if you resonate with my Deutsche Bank example or something similar to it, then just reflect and say, you know what, am I trying to solve a problem that's really not my problem? Is it really a stakeholder problem? And then switch your lens. And I see that over and over again because I think it's that's a non-starter. It's really difficult to solve that from the outside for the stakeholders and to have a good outcome.
Absolutely. Now, we will put the link to the product owner book as well as the Badass Agile coaching book down below so people can go and check those out. But coming back to this user stories topic and putting the stories back into the user stories, is there a book, a video, a podcast, a blog post, in any way a resource that you could recommend for those of us who want to understand that better and get more into the topic?
Now that's a really good question. And I can't believe I'm saying this, Vasco, but I don't think I've written something about it. So I think the answer is no. Maybe in story mapping and patterns work and things like that, you'll see folks talking about the context, but not the way I'm talking about it. Now, there is something that I might offer. I have done a workshop with people, and this is an important point. It's easy for me to say storytelling. I think you have to practice it. And I suggest practicing it on the large. So the workshop I talk about story. So I think there's aspects of storytelling. There's books on telling stories that are useful for product owners to their skills. There's a blog post about Disney telling stories, storytelling in their movies, in their animation, and the art of storytelling. So I think there's some research you can do or reading you can do about the art of storytelling. It's not just winging it, but there's some nuance to it that you can learn. The other thing is practice. What I do in this little 1 hour workshop is I just try to get people to practice and get comfortable with. I give them a really big, three big options, three big epics, like design a refrigerator, the refrigerator of the future, right? And I have a picture of this huge refrigerator, or your bucket list vacation. I talk about it being on a Tahiti island and designing your vacation. And then Mousetrap, a computer game for the game of Mousetrap, something really big. And I invite them. I'm like, okay, now take 10 minutes and write user stories to implement the refrigerator. And they make some progress and write them well. Write them according to your prescription or your models. And then take a step back and take 15 minutes. And now I want you to tell some stories around envision the refrigerator and what are some of the possibilities. And I talk and get rambunctious. One of the nice things about stories, we get minimalist. So I think MVPs do us a disservice, Vasco, where we take a minimalist approach before we have a maximus vision sometimes. And to me, storytelling, the power of it is start with the maximus and then go to the minimus. Start with what's the art of the possible before we start chipping away at it and get some excitement going. And we practice for 15 minutes the storytelling. And you should see the energy shift in the room. It goes from quiet to loud. There's laughter. There's envisioning. There's excitement. There's the art of the possible. Someone talked about having a pipeline from the refrigerator in New York was going to have a pipeline under the Atlantic Ocean to Dublin, Ireland, to have Guinness that would be transported. The Guinness would be transported under the ocean to a tap in my refrigerator. Now that's not possible, but I want to surface that in the storytelling. Imagine how exciting. We're not going to implement that, but imagine the excitement of that and the ideas that might evolve from it. Well, maybe we can do canned Guinness or something or whatever, but it's that the art. So practice in it before you, I guess what I'm saying is try to practice your storytelling and maybe practice it on a contrived example before you start bringing it into, and a safe example before you start bringing it into your teams.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and recommend Made to Stick by the Heath brothers. It's a book that is awesome at helping you understand what makes stories stick in the mind of the listener. But I definitely want to buy that refrigerator now, Bob.
It's a really interesting. I will send you. I have it packaged up. I have the handout that I use, Vasco, and I'll send it to you. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I'll send it to you to share with people.
Absolutely. We'll definitely put the link then down below under the video. Of course, Bob, we want to thank you immensely for being here, for sharing all of that experience and storytelling ability also with the community. But before you go, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
The best way, it's a simple way, is I have an alter ego, everyone, called the Agile Moose. And so that's a story for another time. Haha. So it's agile-moose.com. And I blog there and I have some materials there. There's a reference site for the book there, the coaching book, where I have supplemental materials. And that's a great place to sort of stay connected to me. You can join my newsletter there, etc. So Agile-Moose is a good place. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So join me, connect with me.
Absolutely.
That would
And the
be a great way.
LinkedIn link is already down below, but the Agile Moose website link will be added shortly. So first of all, of course, thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge, Bob. Do you have for us one last parting word of advice?
I think I want to challenge everyone. If any of you, I'm reaching out into the virtual world, and I'm hearing doubts. We don't have time for storytelling. That Bob, you don't understand where I'm in this environment, or I'm in that environment, or I'm in a financial. Yesterday, one of the questions was, I heard from I did another talk yesterday, and someone said, I'm in a financial environment, and it's fast paced. We don't have time to think. We just have to work.
Don't have time to think. Well, that's a phrase.
Yeah. So what I'm challenging everyone is I'm challenging you to experiment with the art of storytelling from a product perspective. You don't have to change globally, but I'm challenging you to try it because it's effective, because it changes the dynamics, because it was there in the beginning and we've lost it. So I'm challenging everyone to bring it back, damn it. We need to bring back storytelling into Agile user stories. So there, I put the ball in your hands.
Yeah,
Try it
and you
out.
can do it with just one story. Like, don't go, 100% into it. You can just start with one story, practice it, learn,
Run,
get
run
feedback,
the
and get better.
experiment. Yep, absolutely. And that's what I'll leave with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Bob, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Bosco, it's my pleasure. Thank you everyone for listening. Bosco, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to see you, my friend.